The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky heavy with ash and salt. It was 1944 and the tide of war had turned, but not evenly. The Japanese Empire, though bleeding from 1,000 wounds, still fought with the ferocity of cornered beasts. Islands once unknown to the world now bore names written in blood: Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Rabaul. Each was a scar across the ocean, and each had claimed its share of souls. Among the airmen stationed in the Philippines stood Lieutenant Thomas "Tom" McGuire, a name that would one day be whispered in both reverence and disbelief. He was young, just 24, but his eyes were older, dulled by the weight of too many missions and too many empty chairs in the mess hall. His P-38 Lightning, sleek and silver, gleamed under the tropical sun like a blade drawn for battle. He called it Pudgy 4, named after the sweetheart waiting for him back home. But in the final months of 1944, home felt like a ghost and love a distant luxury. The air war was consuming everything. Each morning began with the same ritual: the low growl of engines warming on the runway, the choking stench of fuel, the sharp bark of orders cutting through humid air. Ground crews worked in silence, their hands trembling slightly as they checked the flaps and gun mounts. They had seen too many aircraft take off and never return. The pilots, outwardly calm, carried the quiet knowledge that any flight could be their last. They joked to kill the fear, laughed to silence the screaming part of the mind that counted the odds. But the fear was always there, lurking like the shadow of the enemy below the clouds. McGuire was not the reckless type. Unlike some of his comrades, he didn't believe in luck. He believed in precision, discipline, and the cold mathematics of survival. His kills, 38, confirmed, were not born of impulse, but calculation. Yet there was a part of him that understood something deeper. In war, logic only went so far. Sooner or later, chaos made its own rules. His squadron, the 401st Fighter Squadron, the Satan's Angels, had been flying non-stop sorties to cripple Japanese air power before the American invasion of Luzon. The Japanese, though outnumbered, were far from beaten. Their Zeros still sliced through the skies with eerie grace, piloted by men whose belief in death as honor made them terrifying foes. One afternoon, as rain clouds gathered like bruises over the mountains, McGuire sat on an ammo crate beside his Lightning, hands clasped, watching the distant horizon. He had flown 12 hours the day before, escorting bombers over Clark Field, and lost 2 men. He could still see their planes burning in the jungle below. The mechanics gave him a nod, and he stood, pulling his gloves tighter. The air smelled of oil and thunder. "Let's bring them home," he muttered to himself, though he knew not all would. The squadron took off into a curtain of grey. Visibility was poor, the air thick with storm vapor. Somewhere above the clouds, enemy fighters waited. The Japanese had begun a desperate campaign to contest the skies, launching ambushes with small but lethal formations. McGuire's job was simple: protect the bombers, engage the enemy, and make it back alive. But fate had other plans. At 18,000 feet, the storm broke. The clouds split apart, revealing a battlefield of sunlight and fire. Japanese fighters, Mitsubishi Ki-84, Franks, dived in from above, their cannon fire tearing through the formation. Tracer rounds streaked like burning comets. Radio chatter filled the headsets. Panic, orders, cries for help. "I got one on my 6. Brake left. I can't shake him." McGuire's instincts took over. He rolled hard, banked upward, and locked onto a Frank trying to intercept a damaged P-38. His guns spat flame, and the enemy plane disintegrated in a shower of smoke. But for every one downed, 2 more appeared. It was chaos, pure and blinding. The air vibrated with explosions, wings ripped apart, engines trailing black smoke into the sea. McGuire shouted to his wingman, Major Jack Rittmeyer, but static drowned out the words. He saw Rittmeyer chasing a pair of enemy planes toward the clouds. And then he was gone. The sudden silence of the radio hit harder than any gunfire. McGuire's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He banked low, eyes scanning the horizon, the ocean glittering far below like a mirror of death. Hours later, back at base, only half the squadron returned. The runway was lined with medics and mechanics waiting for ghosts. The remaining pilots climbed down from their planes in silence. Some cried. Others just stared at the ground. McGuire removed his helmet, eyes hollow. His commanding officer approached. "You did well out there." McGuire didn't answer. He just looked toward the setting sun, its light bleeding red over the jungle. He had done well, but it didn't feel like victory. That night, the rain returned. McGuire sat in his tent, writing a letter he would never send. "They say heroes die for their country," he wrote. "But out here we just die, maybe that's enough." The wind howled outside, rattling the canvas. Somewhere far off, the rumble of distant artillery echoed. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his flight jacket. By January 1945, McGuire's legend had spread. He was closing in on Major Richard Bong's record, the highest-scoring American ace of the war. But McGuire wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing survival. Each mission carried a shadow heavier than the last. The Japanese air resistance, though fractured, was fanatical. Pilots were now trained to die before surrender. McGuire knew that every dogfight might be his last, yet he kept flying. He owed it to the men who couldn't. The morning of January the 7th dawned clear and cruel. Intelligence reported enemy fighters near Los Negros Island. McGuire led a flight of 4 P-38s, himself, Rittmeyer, Captain Edwin Weaver, and Lieutenant Douglas Throp. As they climbed through blue skies, McGuire felt an unease in his gut. His plane carried drop tanks for extended range, heavy and unwieldy in combat. Standard procedure was to jettison them before engagement, but McGuire refused. He didn't want to waste the fuel. It was a small decision, but one that would decide his fate. At 10,000 feet, Weaver called out, "Bandits! 2 o'clock high!" 4 Japanese fighters appeared, led by an ace, Captain Akira Sugimoto. They dove in, guns blazing. McGuire rolled to intercept, his lightning trembling from the strain of its full load. The first bursts of cannon fire ripped through the air. Weaver broke right, Rittmeyer climbed, Throp descended to flank. McGuire stayed in the center, forcing Sugimoto to focus on him. The dance of death began again, metal against metal, man against fate. As McGuire turned hard into a climb, his overloaded P-38 stalled. The nose pitched upward, then dropped violently. He fought for control, yanking the stick with all his strength. For a split second, the world inverted, the sea, the sky, the sunlight all spinning into chaos. Weaver shouted over the radio, "Tom, drop your tanks, you're too heavy." But McGuire didn't respond. The plane was falling, nose first, smoke trailing, the wind screaming through shattered metal. And then, impact, a flash of fire on the horizon. Back at base, the radio went silent. The men waited for a call that never came. McGuire's P-38 was found days later, crumpled in the jungle near Negros. His body was recovered beside the wreckage, still strapped in, his flight jacket stained with the ink of his last letter. He had died trying to save his wingman, a suicidal dive that turned into his final, impossible kill. They buried him where he fell, the jungle swallowing the echoes of his name. The war would rage on for months, but among the airmen of the Pacific, one story began to spread. A story of a man who fought the storm until it took him, and in doing so, became part of it. The dawn that followed Lieutenant McGuire's death did not bring peace, only a heavier silence. The men of the 431st Squadron stood on the tarmac, watching the tropical mist drift over the wreckage of returning aircraft. Some planes limped home, trailing smoke, others never came back. The mechanic crews worked without speaking, their faces drawn tight, their hands coated with the grime of endless war. McGuire's name was painted on the wall of the operations tent, added to the growing list of the fallen. The Pacific Air War had become a war of ghosts, aces killing aces, skies littered with burning metal, names vanishing into static. And yet, even in death, McGuire's legacy burned like a flare. His suicidal dive to protect his squadron became both legend and curse, a story that would haunt every pilot who strapped into a cockpit. January 1945, Mindoro Island. The invasion of Luzon was underway. The Allies needed the skies cleared before the main fleet advanced, and the Japanese were throwing everything they had left into the fire. Kamikaze units, fueled by desperation and national madness, launched from every available strip. These were not the disciplined duels of earlier years, these were storms of chaos. Entire squadrons dove into ships, engines screaming like banshees. The American Navy fought a nightmare that seemed to multiply with every sunrise. On the airfields, pilots prepared, knowing that the enemy they met in the sky no longer intended to live. Captain Edwin Weaver, now the acting leader of the 431st, sat in the ready room surrounded by the stench of sweat, smoke, and fear. He was only 26, but felt twice that. The room was dim, lit by a single bulb swinging from the ceiling as the wind beat the tent walls. A new pilot, barely 20, asked, "Sir, do you think we'll make it?" Weaver's eyes didn't move from the map spread across the table. "We'll fly," he said quietly. "That's all that matters." There was no courage in his tone, only resignation. That afternoon, the alarm bells sounded, enemy formation approaching from the northwest. Weaver's squadron scrambled, boots pounding the mud as propellers roared to life. Engines screamed as the P-38s lifted from the runway, twin tails slicing through the sunlight. The ground fell away, replaced by the endless blue of the South China Sea. Ahead lay the enemy, a swarm of Japanese Ki-84s, escorting a group of kamikazes bound for the Allied fleet. Weaver's breath steadied. "All right, boys," he said into the radio. "This is for Tom. Let's finish what he started." The two forces collided at 15,000 feet. The air ignited with tracer fire. Gunfire shredded clouds into ribbons of smoke. Pilots shouted over the radio, voices rising over the chaos. "Bandit at 3 o'clock. He's on my tail. Break left." A kamikaze plane burst into flame, but another dove through the smoke, aiming straight for an American destroyer below. Weaver's squadron tried to intercept, but the kamikaze's descent was too steep, too fast. The sea erupted as the plane slammed into its target, throwing up a geyser of fire and steel. The sound of the explosion reached even the pilots above, a dull, distant roar that settled like grief in their bones. Weaver locked onto a Japanese fighter cutting toward his wingman. He pulled the trigger, guns blazing. The enemy aircraft broke apart mid-air, wings spiraling into the ocean. But as he rolled away, cannon shells tore through his right wing. Warning lights screamed. He struggled for control, sweat streaming into his eyes. "Mayday! I'm hit!" he shouted. His P-38 lurched downward, flames licking the fuselage. For a moment he considered bailing, but the thought of capture, of ending up in enemy hands, froze him. He tightened his grip, trying to level out. The world blurred into streaks of blue and red. At the last moment, the fire died, the engine sputtered back to life, and Weaver somehow pulled up just above the waves. He let out a sharp breath, heart pounding. Death had brushed past him, but not yet claimed him. By the time the battle ended, the sky was littered with smoke trails and debris. 16 Japanese planes had been downed, but the cost was steep. 2 Americans dead, 3 missing. The survivors landed in silence. Weaver climbed out of his battered P-38, his flight suit scorched and torn. He looked toward the jungle beyond the airstrip and thought of McGuire's grave. "You'd have loved that fight, Tom," he murmured, half a grin breaking through the exhaustion. But there was no joy in the victory, only the numbness that followed survival. Night fell like a shroud. The base was lit by dim lanterns, the hum of generators blending with the distant thunder of artillery from Luzon. In the mess tent, the men gathered over tin cups of black coffee, their laughter hollow and forced. One pilot, still shaking, whispered, "They're not fighting anymore, they're dying on purpose." Another nodded, eyes wide. "That's what scares me. How do you fight someone who wants to die?" Weaver didn't answer. He knew the truth. The war had crossed a threshold where strategy and courage meant little. What remained was willpower, the refusal to break even as everything else crumbled. A week later, orders came through for another mission, escort duty over the Lingayen Gulf. The fleet below was under relentless kamikaze assault. Weaver's squadron was to intercept enemy formations before they reached the ships. The pilots geared up silently. Before mounting his plane, Weaver walked past McGuire's old Lightning, what was left of it. The mechanics had salvaged the nose cone and mounted it near the hangar, painted with the words, "Fly to the end." Weaver touched the metal and whispered, "I'll keep it flying, buddy." The mission began under a cruel sun. The sea below glittered deceptively calm, masking the inferno that awaited. The radar picked up blips, 20 enemy planes inbound, then 30. "Eyes up," Weaver said. "They're coming in waves." The enemy appeared out of the sun, their planes flashing silver and red. The dogfight exploded instantly. P-38s dove and climbed, tracers cutting criss-crossing arcs through the sky. Kamikazes broke through, diving vertically toward the fleet below. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ships, creating a storm of steel that filled the air. It was chaos, a living, breathing storm of death. One kamikaze broke through the line, aiming for the carrier USS Columbia. Weaver saw it too late. He dove, throttling hard, trying to intercept. The Japanese plane was already burning, but its course was steady. Weaver lined up the shot, fired, and hit the enemy's tail. The plane exploded mid-air, too close. The shockwave struck his Lightning like a hammer. His canopy cracked, and a piece of shrapnel sliced across his face. He screamed, vision blurring as his plane spiraled downward. Somehow he regained control and pulled up, gasping, blood dripping into his collar. He'd saved the carrier, but the cost was a scar that would never fade. When Weaver landed that evening, the men surrounded his plane, cheering weakly. "That was suicide, sir," one said. Weaver only nodded. "Yeah," he muttered, "seems to be contagious." He looked toward the horizon where smoke still rose from burning ships. The sky had turned red again, the same shade he'd seen when McGuire fell. The war had not ended with Tom's death. It had simply taken new forms, each darker than the last. As the days bled into weeks, the squadron continued its grim work: intercept, engage, survive. Each sortie became a test of endurance rather than skill. Supplies were low, fuel was rationed, and morale was a fragile thread. Letters from home grew fewer, their words brittle with worry. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but in the Pacific it felt endless. The men fought not for victory now, but for each other. Every mission was a promise, to the dead, to the living, to themselves, that they would keep flying no matter the odds. In February, the Americans captured Manila. The Japanese resistance was collapsing, but their airmen fought with renewed ferocity, determined to die with honor. Weaver's squadron flew one of their last major engagements over Luzon, a final desperate clash that left the skies littered with wrecks. When the smoke cleared, the 451st had lost 3 more pilots. Weaver walked among the debris, his boots crunching over twisted metal. The jungle was silent except for the buzz of flies over the wreckage. He stopped beside a destroyed P-38, its nose art half burned away. The words "fly to the end" were barely visible. He knelt, resting a hand on the scorched fuselage. "You were right, Tom," he whispered. "The storm never ends, it just changes shape." Above him, the sky was grey, heavy, endless. The war had devoured the young, the brave, and the lost. But somewhere within the smoke and ruin, a strange peace stirred. The quiet knowledge that courage had not been wasted, that even in suicidal dives and impossible kills, there was meaning. The Pacific was dying. By mid-1945, the empire that once stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands was collapsing under its own ashes. The sea was thick with oil slicks, the air haunted by drifting smoke from burning wrecks. The United States Navy ruled the waters now, and the skies belonged to the ghosts of pilots who had paid for them in blood. Among the airmen still standing was Captain Edwin Weaver. He had survived the inferno of Luzon, the relentless kamikaze waves, and the suffocating weight of survivor's guilt. Yet survival did not feel like victory. It felt like a sentence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw McGuire's final dive, the explosion over Negros, the shockwave that had seemed to split the sky in half. Some nights he woke gasping, still hearing the roar of engines and the crackle of flames that never stopped burning. By March, Weaver's squadron had been reassigned to Okinawa, the last great battle before the gates of Japan itself. It was the deadliest campaign of the Pacific War, a meat grinder of land, sea, and sky. The Japanese air forces, though decimated, continued their kamikaze tactics with frightening intensity. Pilots barely out of adolescence climbed into aircraft loaded with explosives, bowing to photographs of the Emperor before taking off on one-way missions. For the Americans stationed on Okinawa, there was no safety. Kamikazes struck day and night, shattering the horizon with fire. The island's airfields became targets, and the 431st Squadron lived in constant readiness. Weaver had changed. The confident young captain was gone, replaced by a man who spoke little and slept less. His flight suit hung loose on him, his hands trembling slightly whenever he held a cup of coffee. He kept McGuire's letter, recovered from the wreckage, folded in his breast pocket. The paper was burned around the edges, but the words still legible. Maybe that's enough. It had become his mantra. Maybe survival, not victory, was enough. Maybe remembering was enough. April the 12th, 1945. The day began with a false calm. The sea shimmered under the morning sun, and for the first time in weeks, no enemy blips appeared on the radar. The men relaxed slightly, smoking near their planes, trading jokes that no one truly laughed at. Then just after noon, the alarm sirens wailed, massive formation inbound. Weaver sprinted for his P-38, the ground vibrating under the thunder of engines. "All flights scramble, kamikazes inbound from the northwest." The air was filled with the shriek of metal and the frantic pounding of boots. Within minutes, the sky was alive with streaking silver shapes, dozens of Japanese planes diving low across the sea. The 431st roared into the sky to meet them. Weaver's voice cut through the radio. "Remember what we're fighting for. Keep formation. Watch your brothers." The two forces collided above the waves, sunlight flashing off wings and tracer rounds tearing through the air like lightning. Weaver's guns lit up, cutting down a Zero that streaked toward a destroyer below. Another kamikaze broke through, exploding against a cruiser's deck in a tower of flame. The heat was felt even from a mile away. The radio erupted with chaos. "They're everywhere! We've got more coming from altitude! I'm hit!" Weaver pulled hard into a climb, sweat dripping down his forehead. Ahead, he spotted a small formation of Japanese fighters protecting a single kamikaze plane. It was slow, damaged, its pilot clearly wounded, but still flying straight toward the fleet. Weaver felt something twist inside him. The image of McGuire flashed before his eyes, the dive, the fire, the silence afterward. "Not again," he whispered. He throttled forward, pushing the P-38 into a steep dive. His guns spat fury, shredding two of the escorts. The kamikaze kept going. Weaver lined up behind it, closing the gap. He could see the pilot through the shattered canopy. A young man, maybe 19, face calm as he mouthed a silent prayer. Weaver hesitated for a split second, finger trembling on the trigger. Then he fired. The plane exploded in mid-air, a ball of flame that lit the clouds. The shockwave hit Weaver's lightning, rattling the frame. He banked hard, escaping the debris. His heart pounded, not from adrenaline, but from something deeper. Pity. He had looked into the eyes of a man willing to die for a cause already lost. When the battle ended, the sky was black with smoke. The Americans had repelled the attack, but at a cost. 5 ships damaged, hundreds dead. Weaver landed on the scarred runway, the sun bleeding red through the haze. He climbed from his plane and stood for a long time, staring toward the sea. He could smell the burning oil drifting in from the coast. The war was supposed to be nearing its end, yet the killing seemed endless. He thought of McGuire, of the men who had fallen since, and wondered what victory even meant anymore. Weeks passed. News came from Europe. Germany had surrendered. The camp erupted in muted celebration, but Weaver felt no joy. The Pacific was still burning, and he knew Japan would not yield easily. When word spread of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, a heavy silence fell over the airfield. Some cheered, others stared at the ground. Weaver said nothing. He only thought of the young kamikaze pilot's face, the calm acceptance of death. Now an entire city had vanished in seconds. The world had entered a new kind of darkness, one without heroes, only consequences. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. The war was finally over. Weaver was there, flying escort above the fleet as the ceremony unfolded. From his cockpit, he watched the sunlight glint off the deck below, saw the Japanese delegation bow before General MacArthur, and felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. There should have been triumph, relief, something. Instead, there was only quiet. The radio crackled with static, and Weaver spoke softly, to no one in particular. "It's done, Tom. We made it through, but what did it cost us?" After the surrender, the 431st Squadron was disbanded. The men went home, those who could. Weaver returned to the States in late 1945, stepping off the transport plane into a world that felt alien. Crowds cheered at the airfield, bands played, and banners waved, but behind every smiling face he saw the ghosts of those who didn't return. He visited McGuire's family in Ridgewood, New Jersey, handing them the letter that had survived the crash. McGuire's mother wept silently as Weaver read it aloud. When he finished, she smiled faintly and said, "He always said flying made him feel closer to heaven." Weaver couldn't speak. He only nodded, staring at the sky outside the window. In the years that followed, Weaver drifted. The war had taken more than comrades. It had taken meaning. He worked odd jobs, drank too much, and avoided talking about the past. Some nights he'd walk to the airfield near his home and watch civilian planes take off, their engines soft and harmless compared to the thunder of the P-38. The world had moved on, but he couldn't. Every roar of an engine was a memory. McGuire's dive, the kamikaze's scream, the burning horizon. In 1947, Weaver finally visited the Philippines again, returning to Negros Island where McGuire had fallen. The jungle had reclaimed most of the wreckage, vines twisting through the rusted frame. He knelt beside what remained of the P-38, brushing away the dirt from the fuselage. The metal was cool, rough, beneath his fingers. He pulled out McGuire's flight wings, salvaged years ago, and placed them gently on the ground. "You got your wish, Tom," he whispered. "You flew to the end." The air was still, broken only by the sound of distant waves. For the first time in years, Weaver felt something close to peace. Decades later, historians would debate McGuire's final mission. Some called it reckless, others heroic. But among the men who had fought beside him, there was no question. His dive wasn't a mistake. It was an act of devotion, the purest form of loyalty a man could give. His sacrifice became a symbol of the human cost behind every medal, every victory. In 1946, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But the paper and the medal couldn't capture what the men remembered: the rain, the fire, the silence that followed his fall. Weaver lived to see old age, but the war never truly left him. In his final years, he wrote a letter to the families of his fallen squadron, telling them that courage wasn't measured by who survived, but by who dared to fight, despite knowing they might not. "We didn't fly for glory," he wrote. "We flew for each other. And in the end, that's what made us human." When he died in 1983, they buried him beside McGuire in Arlington National Cemetery. The headstones stood side by side, two names carved into white stone beneath the same wide sky they once ruled. Visitors often stopped to read them, unaware of the story that bound them together, the suicidal dive that turned into legend, and the man who lived to carry its shadow. The Pacific winds still whispered through the trees, carrying the faint echo of engines long gone. The world has changed since then. The oceans are quiet now, the islands healed with time. But in the hearts of those who study the war, the story of Lieutenant Thomas McGuire and the 431st Squadron remains eternal. A reminder that even in the darkest skies, humanity flickered like a flame refusing to die. And though the world may forget the details, the courage of those who dove into the storm will forever be written in the clouds above the Pacific. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.